So listen, today I want to talk about that time when a certain German state took on half of Europe and the war that ignited across the... Wait, no, I'm not talking about this one. I'm talking about an older German state. You know, the one that had a monarch, when they fought 3 to 4 continental superpowers in this big conflict that took over the entire region. Nope, not that one either. But I think I'm starting to see a bit of a pattern here. You know what? Let me just write it down so I don't get it wrong again. What I specifically want to talk about are the Prussians, and how in the 7-Year War they took on France, Russia, Austria, Sweden, and Saxony. And I want to talk about it because on paper it wasn't a fair fight, and this middling German state should have been wiped out if it wasn't for the fact that on the battlefield these guys could punch way above their weight. And my analogy for 18th century Prussia, the way I like to think about them, is that they're like the werewolves of Europe. You know, when the sun is shining and there's peace around, they're not that scary. They don't have any technological advantages over anyone, any material advantages, any manpower superiority. But then the moon comes out and they turn into monsters in battle. And to understand that transformation, you have to start with the man who controlled the beast, this guy right here, Fredrick II, better known as Fredrick the Great. And he really did control it because, unlike the other 18th century kings and queens who had to defer to their ministries and generals on matters of war, Frederick was an absolute monarch, meaning that whatever he said was final, no debates. And that included the strategic high-level stuff, but also the tactical things, which meant that he was always near the front lines, inspecting troops, scouting terrain, giving speeches. And one of the biggest problems he faced across most of his campaigns, but especially during the 7-Year War, was that at this tactical level, when he came to draw up the plan of battle, he'd have to find a way to defeat an army that outnumbered his. This was especially challenging when you consider that he was operating in the era of linear formations, where most battles during the 18th and 17th century generally involved both sides lining up their infantry in parallel like this, and walking straight into one another. So his challenge consisted of coming up with ways to avoid marching his men into an enemy that outgunned them. His solution came from realizing that you could beat linear armies by using non-linear tactics, where what he'd do so often is commit a small portion of his forces to pin down or distract the enemy on one side, and in the meantime he'd move the bulk of his soldiers around and towards the enemy's flank, and in doing so he was able to catch the enemy off guard and negate their numerical superiority. But this also brings up a very obvious question, right? Which is, why didn't everyone fight in a non-linear way? Were they stupid? Well, it wasn't that. More than it was the fact that to successfully execute such tactics was incredibly difficult. And it's one of those concepts that's hard for me to demonstrate using my low-tech whiteboard method where I'm moving just a couple of pieces here and there, but on a battlefield, when you're trying to coordinate the movements of thousands of soldiers and move them as a single unit, even the slightest misstep or delay can throw everything into chaos. So most armies preferred linear warfare simply because getting your men to start and stop was hard enough, let alone all the complications that could come up if you decided to add a change in direction. But of course, this naturally leads to the next question, doesn't it? Which is, why the hell were the Prussians so good at maneuvering in battle? And that makes sense when you read about how the entire army practiced for it. For example, in his book The German Way of War, historian Robert M. Citino talks about how the infantry were drilled at a pace unlike any other in Europe, and that months of learning how to march and step across parade grounds resulted in an army that could change formation smoothly and carry out complex tactical maneuvers without losing cohesion. Citino also mentions that they were trained to reload and fire their muskets faster than anyone else. Supposedly, a well-trained Prussian platoon could fire 3 rounds a minute, which doesn't sound that impressive until you compare to the Austrian rate of just 1 round a minute. In his book, The Army of Frederick the Great, historian Christopher Duffy adds that the leadership participated at an event known as the Autumn Maneuvers, where every year the captains and generals would run simulations and practice things like how to raid a fortified position, carry out a foraging expedition, conduct a retreat. Just all these different scenarios that were designed to give Prussian officers realistic practice at how to manage large groups of soldiers. And there's no better example of all that practice paying off than at the battle that I want to talk about today, the Battle of Leuthen in 1757. When, with the fate of Prussia on the line, Frederick is forced to push his tactical innovations and his army's training to its absolute limit, and execute a plan that Citino calls one of the most complex approach marches in the entire history of linear warfare. But before I get to the battle itself, it helps if I very briefly explain the political problems that led to it here on my map of Central Europe. And the best place to start is in 1740, when Frederick Wilhelm II became king, which is the same year he attacked a slice of Austrian territory called Silesia right over here. He successfully takes it and concludes the First Silesian War in 1742. Obviously, the Austrians weren't too happy about this, so in 1744 they attack to try and get it back, but the Prussians held on and the Second Silesian War ended in 1745. Now, because Silesia was industrially rich and strategically important, the Habsburgs weren't willing to let it go so easily. So in their attempt to try and get it back, they put together an alliance with France, Russia, Saxony, and Sweden to help them do it. And whilst they were doing this in the 1750s, Frederick, who knew what was coming, decided that instead of watching the Avengers assemble and converge on his territory, he realizes that the odds would favor him a lot more if he went out on the offensive and beat them each one by one. So in 1756, he attacks first and wins a bunch of battles. He does the same thing in early 1757. However, in June of that year, he suffers a huge defeat at the Battle of Kolin that forces him to retreat and for the alliance to begin closing in. But in November, Frederick starts a comeback tour when he first moves west and annihilates a combined allied force at a stunning victory known as the Battle of Rossbach. During that time, an Austrian force under one Prince Charles Alexandre of Lorraine had moved into Silesia, so in December Frederick marched his men to confront them, where on December the 5th he runs into them at a village called Leuthen. In the early hours of December the 5th, the Prussians had been advancing towards Leuthen, where they first went into a small Austrian outpost at Born, which is quickly cleared out by the vanguard, and the village then stationed by Frederick and the entire Prussian army of about 36,000 men. Then, for the next few hours, the king rode around with his staff to survey the Austrian position, during which he was incredibly optimistic because the entire area that was to become a battlefield had been used for peacetime maneuvers in the previous years. But he was also optimistic because he believed Prince Charles had about the same number of units as him, when in fact he had almost double, around 66,000 in total, mostly deployed around Leuthen and the nearby villages. Still, Frederick's familiarity with the land, along with his inspection, allows him to put together the following picture. Firstly, that the terrain to the north, close to the hamlet of Nippern, was full of marshes and bogs that would have made an assault there very difficult. Secondly, that between the two armies, towards the south, lay a chain of knolls and a series of low hills. And finally, that beyond this elevated stretch, a little to the south, stood the town of Lobetins. Based on that information, this is the plan he comes up with. A small vanguard force is to deploy towards the northern side here as if we were planning an attack on the Austrian right, to keep Prince Charles' attention pinned to that side of the battlefield. In the meantime, the main army will arrange itself into two large columns and, using the terrain as cover, advance towards Lobetins, upon which they will turn, advance again, then wheel into the Austrian left flank. Now, the official Prussian history, which is generally very detailed, fails to give us the exact pattern of halts, advances, and sidesteps involved in this process to the right over here, but every historian that's written about it, Citino, Duffy, Showalter, all of them agree that its degree of difficulty was such that no other army could have executed it without messing it up. And this makes sense when you understand that the challenge was not just in keeping the infantry together for this maneuver, but you also had to keep the cavalry together with them, the artillery, even the supply wagons all had to move and turn and arrive at the same time. And the whole thing is so unorthodox, so outside of the thinking at the time, that even when the long Prussian columns began to move at 11 a.m., Prince Charles, who sees them doing this, he sees them disappearing behind the terrain, he doesn't even think that the Prussians are moving on the offensive. He actually thinks that they're retreating. And what's worse is that no light cavalry, no light Austrian cavalry are sent to go check. Even after the battle, Frederick said that had a single Austrian scouting party been sent in that direction, they would have uncovered everything. What concerned the Austrian command more at that point in time were the Prussian soldiers forming on their right. And in thinking that that's where Frederick's main attack would come, they take the bait and begin sending their cavalry reserve units in support. By noon, the first Prussian columns, which had until that point remained undetected, reached Lobetins and a little beyond. Frederick, who was by this point stationed at the village, could see the entire Austrian position and ordered the Prussian vanguard, supported by artillery, to now swing left and attack. As they did so, the Austrians, who were caught entirely off guard, came under heavy fire, yet they still managed to launch their cavalry in response. But this was silenced by the Prussian infantry, who quickly deployed and forced them to retreat. By 1 p.m, the battle was in full swing, and what was now the Prussian right wing continued its advance into the Austrian left, and with the support of cannon fire, routed several Austrian battalions caught in the action. Prince Charles, who was now getting word that his left flank was quickly collapsing, began to send orders for his men to regroup around Leuthen. The prince also sent orders for a few divisions to help his left, but they arrived piecemeal and, running into their own panicked men, were thrown back. By 2 p.m, the Austrian left had disintegrated, and the main Prussian attack towards Leuthen was ready. Charles, who had by now managed to swing his men into a new position around the village, ordered them to dig ditches and build batteries in preparation for its defense. Frederick, who knew that heavy fighting was to come, planned to send in his entire army, including his left wing, which had until now remained back. At 2:30 p.m, 3 Prussian infantry battalions were hurled against the village of Leuthen, followed by the rest of the line, who broke through. For the next half an hour, the contest between the infantry was intense, as both sides fought for control. But by 3 p.m, the Austrians had sustained high casualties and began to flee. At this point, the Prussians had control of most of Leuthen, and the battle was almost won. However, instead of collapsing at the brink, several Austrian infantry and cavalry units actually rallied, and I want you guys to listen to how historian Dennis Showalter, in his book Fredrick the Great, A Military History, I want you to listen to how he describes the Austrian last stand and the vicious fighting that took place towards the end. Quote, "What was remarkable about this situation was the Austrians holding their ground when the final Prussian advance began around 3:30 p.m. By this time, Leuthen was full of stragglers and fugitives, but the men remaining in ranks fought it out to the muzzle. Let it be said too, that a German regiment, supplied by the Franconian bishopric of Würzburg, held Leuthen's churchyard against Frederick's guard and inflicted heavy casualties on that elite regiment and the 10th Infantry before giving way to superior numbers and to the guns brought up to knock down the walls. As the Prussian advance finally cleared Leuthen, the Austrians mounted a massive cavalry attack. 70 fresh squadrons were driving on the open Prussian left flank when Lieutenant General Wilhelm von Driesen earned his footnote in history by launching a counterattack with the 40 squadrons of Prussian cavalry which had followed the main army earlier in the day and taken position at right angles to the infantry's left flank instead of forming directly in line with the musketeers. This gave Driesen a tactical advantage that compensated for his inferior numbers. He charged as the Austrians rode across his front. First to get stuck in were the Bayreuth Dragoons, who found the Austrians altogether tougher to chew than they had been on the regiment's great day at Hohenfriedberg in 1745. The Prussian cavalry's second line took its time engaging, according to one account because of regimental jealousy. The cuirassiers, who regarded themselves as the elite of the mounted arm, allegedly sat back to appreciate the discomfiture of their social inferiors. Once they charged, however, the heavy Prussian horsemen drove the Austrians not back along their original line of advance, but eastward into their own infantry still fighting around Leuthen. That was enough. The white coats panicked and fled by battalions. The few units that stood their ground were mown down by the advancing Prussian infantry. Prussian troopers, again taking advantage of easy prey, sabred the fugitives until night put an end to the slaughter. End quote. Now, that was the Battle of Leuthen concluded, but I want to take a minute to talk about it in several wider contexts, because it's one that, along with Rosbach, greatly elevated Frederick's reputation, and which a lot of historians rightfully recognize as his masterpiece. But if you remember at the beginning of the video, I said that Prussia survived the 7-Year War, and whilst Rosbach and Leuthen were responsible for preventing her collapse early on, unlike Napoleon, who 50 years later could finish conflicts in a single blow, here, these two great battles did not end the wider fighting. In fact, the war would continue for another 6 years, and what ended up saving Frederick was one of those truly random events in history. This event is so consequential, so out of left field, that it's referred to as the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. And that miracle was the death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth in 1762. After she died, her temporary replacement was a guy called Peter, Emperor Peter III, who was, well, let's just say we today would call him a fanboy. The more technical term might be Prussiophile. But this guy had such a love for all things Prussia that not only does he withdraw from the war, but he also offers Frederick the use of some of his men in battle, which must have sucked for Austria. But anyway, that sudden shift in Russian leadership, which ensured Prussian survival at the time, has some very interesting parallels if we zoom out to an even wider context. As I also brought up in my introduction, Frederick wouldn't be the last German ruler to try and take on all of Europe, so it's not surprising that the idea of him doing so and surviving would appeal to someone like Adolf Hitler. And Hitler was a big fan of Frederick the Great in general, but as his own attempt at continental supremacy came winding down towards the end of the Second World War, and the Soviets and the Allies closed in, his hope that he might have his own miracle occurred when American President Roosevelt died in early 1945. Of course, looking back today, looking back now, that obviously wasn't going to change anything. But I still found it very interesting, and I want you guys to listen to how the legacy of the German state that lived took refuge in the bunker of the German state that was dying, in historian Anthony Beevor's book, Berlin, The Downfall, 1945. Quote, "These orders to stand fast on the Elbe, coming on top of the unexpected death of President Roosevelt, constituted a great blow to American morale. Roosevelt had died on the 12th of April, but the news was not released until the following day. Goebbels was ecstatic when told on his return from a visit to the front near Kustrin. He telephoned Hitler in the Reich Chancellery bunker immediately. 'My Führer, I congratulate you,' he said. 'Roosevelt is dead. It is written in the stars that the second half of April will be the turning point for us. This Friday, the 13th of April, it is the turning point.' Just a few days before, Goebbels had been reading Carlyle's history of Fredrick II of Prussia aloud to Hitler to lift him from his depression. The passage had been the one where Frederick the Great, faced with disaster in the 7-Year War, thought of taking poison. But suddenly, news of the death of the Tsarina Elizabeth arrived. The miracle of the House of Brandenburg had come to pass. Hitler's eyes had filled with tears at these words. Goebbels did not believe in astrological charts, but he was prepared to use anything to boost the Führer's flagging spirits, and he worked Hitler up into a frenzy of optimism. The recluse in the bunker now gazed lovingly at the portrait of Fredrick the Great, which had been brought down for him. On the next day, 14th of April, in his order of the day to the army, Hitler became utterly carried away. At the moment when fate has removed the greatest war criminal of all time from this earth, the turn of events in this war will be decisive. End quote. Now, if you're interested in buying Anthony Beevor's Berlin, which I recommend you do, it's a fantastic book, or any of the other books that I've used or talked about in today's video, in the description below I've added Amazon affiliate links where if you press them and make the purchase, Papa Bezos tosses me a couple of dollars for my troubles. So thank you if you do that. Anyway, now it's on to my own book, my own piece of work, the collection book. So it's time once again for the collection book, which for those of you who are new to the channel, new to my videos, it's my fun way of keeping track of the battles and the people that I talk about. So for example, here's my Napoleon Bonaparte page, right? For when I was talking about the Napoleonic battles, we have here Marengo, Austerlitz, Friedland, and here's one for the Marshals of France. For France, I also had one here on the Imperial Guard. We had them at Marengo and Austerlitz. My last video, which was on the Roman Republic and the Battle of Illippa, I had here the Titans of the Roman Republic and Triumphs of Rome. It's my sticker for the Battle of Illippa. And this is my Titans of the Roman Republic. We have Scipio, Gaius Marius, all the big names. I asked you guys last time if you thought Gaius Julius Caesar should be on the Republican side or the Imperial side. A lot of you guys said Republic, although there were definitely some good arguments for the Imperial side made. I think I'm going to keep him on the Republican side for now. Anyway, today I'm introducing the Prussian page, where we have heroes of the Prussian state. We've got Frederick William, the Great Elector, Fredrick the Great here. We have Ludendorff, Clausewitz, all the big names. And here we've got the greatest Prussian victories. Got Rossbach, Leuthen, Königgrätz, Sedan, all the big ones. Today my question would be two things. Do you guys think von Clausewitz belongs on the heroes of the Prussian state? Because technically he wasn't, behind any of the great big battles, although he certainly did participate at battles. I don't know, I felt a bit strange about adding him here, despite his contributions to military theory. Felt, he might belong there. And the other one is Erich Ludendorff in the Battle of Tannenberg. Obviously, this is the battle that I want to talk about, but I don't know. He was technically part of a unified German empire, not strictly Prussian, although he was Prussian and the battle was fought on Prussian territory. So I decided to add them anyway because I didn't want to have like a separate page just for them. So let me know in the comments, do you guys think they belong here, or I don't know, should there be some sort of workaround? Anyway, that aside, these are the two stickers I'm adding today. The first one right here is one of the, you can see it properly, it's Karl Röchling's painting of the grenadiers storming the church at Leuthen. You can see it properly. There we go, that's the Battle of Leuthen done. And for the portrait of Frederick the Great, we have this illustration here of French painter Antoine Pen's painting of a young Frederick. I don't know if you can see here. I don't know why it's so out of focus, but you should see the image on the left here. Frederick William II, Frederick the Great. There we go. And there we go. That's Frederick the Great and the Battle of Leuthen done. Thank you so much for watching, as usual. If you can like and subscribe, I do appreciate it so much. Any feedback is always welcome. And I'll see you all next video. Thank you.